Greg Craven, thank you so much for joining me. Now, I think this is a witch hunt that's been driven not so much by individuals, but that too, but also by some state institutions that really need a serious look at themselves. What in this whole process, this gross miscarriage of justice, what has alarmed you most?
Look, the obvious fact that you had a charge that was so full of reasonable doubt it should never even have been made, let alone convicted. But the thing that I suppose worries me most has been the combination of certain institutions that have decided to run a campaign and institutions that shouldn't. And the ones that really stick in my mind are the Victorian Police and the ABC. So you would remember for months we would have breathless interviews from the Victorian Police Commissioner that charges were about to be laid, charges could be made, people being referred to as victims rather than complainants. And just by coincidence, these would be made at exactly the point when the ABC was ready to breathlessly report them in the most extraordinary ways. So you had, in a sense, the coercive power of the state engaged in a very, very cosy deal with the national broadcaster. And I thought that was not only atrocious, but deeply frightening.
Can I just go to the Victorian Police, of course? There was the false evidence they gave to a Victorian parliamentary inquiry claiming falsely that the church had not cooperated in referring victims of child sexual abuse to the police. Completely false. In this particular case, they trawled for victims. They actually placed stories in the paper and ads virtually saying, come to us, we're looking at any crimes that might have occurred at this particular time. This, in British legal cases of miscarriages of justice of exactly this kind of nature, it goes to the point about placing not just false memories in people who have been traumatised, but also encouraging false claims and perhaps people that are after a payout, with the police acting like they believe from the start anything put to them, rather than acting as independent sort of arbitrators where there's any basis to it. Did that concern you as well?
Hugely. It's the complete opposite to ordinary police practice. Ordinary police practice is to investigate possible crimes, not to drum up business for the police themselves because they want there to be a crime. And that was going on. Now, when you put on top of that the fact that you start referring to victims rather than claimants, when you start saying that charges are going to be laid, you've actually got the people who are meant to be investigating crime, promoting crime. Now, that has all sorts of terrible consequences. Now, one of the terrible consequences in this case that I think we can't lose sight of is that we assume the complainant in this case absolutely believes what he says, and that is perfectly possible, then that person has been dragged through 2 or 3 years of legal thorn bushes on a case that ultimately was always going to go down.
And then the Victorian Premier, now don't forget, it's his Court of Appeal that turned down George Pell's appeal in an extraordinary decision, the initial appeal. His police that trawled for complaints against Pell. The Premier today tweeted that he's not going to comment on the High Court decision, but when it comes to victims of child sexual abuse, I hear you, I believe you, people making allegations. Isn't that exactly the attitude that led to this miscarriage of justice? A belief, we all want to help victims, but a belief, apparently an attitude that anyone making a claim will be believed from the start, from the get-go.
Well, the problem is it's a tautology. If you say you'll always believe victims, you've already said they're victims. Of course, everybody always believes victims. It's like saying you believe people who have been burgled. You assume the fact to be true. The question of whether you always believe anybody who makes any particular type of an allegation, whatever the area of law, is simply inconsistent with legal due process, because those allegations have to be tested, as they were tested here.
Finally, we cannot overlook the role of the ABC in this. I think it was disgusting. As recently as this morning, it was still telling untruths about George Pell's trial. Last week, they were falsely claiming that they had found new accusers of George Pell, which was completely false. They weren't new accusers. Their cases had fallen over long ago. What do you make of the role of the ABC in this?
I think it's been absolutely appalling. I did an interview with the ABC about an hour ago when I told them that, and they were not happy to hear the news.
It's gone viral, Greg.
Well, viruses are very common at the moment. I think the reality is that the ABC barracked, the ABC pushed. What I'm most horrified at the moment is, you've had one of the most important cases in Australian legal history, one of the greatest shellacings of a state court of appeal ever. And the news the ABC wants to promote is the possibility that there may be civil claims against Cardinal Pell. Not as far as I'm aware that there are any, but certainly none that have even been properly started, let alone adjudicated or made out, and that there may be charges coming from the redacted parts of the Royal Commission, not that we've seen them, not that any decision has been made to charge, not that anything has been heard. So there is an ongoing attempt to cover up, probably the biggest legal news in Australia since Lindy Chamberlain. So you've got to give them marks for consistency.
I think their shame is just total. Their actions today appalling, and I think I will have to one day devote most of another program to outlining this, because it now is a menace, a public menace, a publicly funded witch hunter general. Greg Craven, thank you so much indeed for your time.
Thank you very much.